There's so much to talk about. You know, we're not going to get through my entire program. Probably we won't even get through half of it. So whatever we stop, I'm going to pick up on my Monday class. And then we'll have plenty of time to ask questions and do, explore all the little byways and so forth. I was initially told I needed to have everything on one program. So I was doing that. And then I found out that no, you can do it your normal way where you have 3 or 4 programs open and you bounce back and forth. And then I found out from Eric earlier today, no, we'd rather be much better to have it all on one. So I go, okay, so let me see what I can pull together. And that's why I'm actually a few minutes late, because I was adding the last slides literally 10 minutes ago. So anyways, let's see. Can we see? You're seeing what I'm seeing? Okay. So this was, the initial part of this was a program I started putting together last June, because June 30th, how many of you have ever heard of Asteroid Day? Yeah, Asteroid Day is celebrated on June 30th, and it's primarily to commemorate the Tunguska event of 1908, about which there have been many unexplained anomalies and mysteries and things surrounding that. But it is, to me, one of the most important cosmic lessons of our time. So I'm going to start with some stuff. I'm going to get into the Tunguska event. I'm going to talk a little bit about asteroids and comets and cycles of change. And then I'll talk a little bit about the sun. I think it's Robert here. Robert, hey, buddy. So, Robert is talking tomorrow, so you'll get the full story and all his updates tomorrow, and don't miss it. Whatever you do, don't miss it. Anyways, let's get started, and Will Durant, the famous historian, said this: civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. And I don't know if you've all heard of his work on the history of civilization, 11 volumes, Will and Ariel Durant. It's kind of considered one of the go-to if you want to get the big picture of the history of civilization on Earth. And after many, many years, and literally 11 volumes, this is kind of his concluding statement. And then I like this from Rumi: "O watchman, be wakeful. It behooves not a watchman to sleep." And given the nature of the environment that we inhabit on planet Earth, that is very good advice. I like to invoke the idea of a cosmic ecosystem, that we really need to be thinking about our planet as part of a much greater system, an ecosystem that includes asteroids, comets, the sun, many other factors, probably on a galactic level as well. And I think that the research is showing that our planet has been affected profoundly in multiple times, multiple ways, both through Earth history and through human history. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is encourage the idea to think bigger, think that we're part of a much bigger ecosystem that's not limited to the surface of the Earth. So we'll start out by talking about cycles of global change. And one of the books that I frequently have referred to is Hamlet's Mill. Came out in 1969, in which they were a couple of highly esteemed scholars who actually believed that there was sophisticated knowledge in prehistory. And one of the things that they hypothesized was that ancient people had observed and knew about the precessional cycle, which is actually a very slow cycle. It works out to about 50 arc seconds per year of motion. How many of you have heard of the vernal equinox, the precession of the equinoxes? You know that each year the position of the sun at the moment of spring equinox, when day and night are precisely the same length, is drifting very slowly to the west, the opposite direction of all of the planetary motion. If you look at the sun, the moon, the planets, throughout the course of their cycles, you'll see they're all moving from west to east. But the vernal equinox, as is the fall equinox and the solstices, are all moving towards the west. That's why it's precession, not procession. But that increment is very small. It's 50 arc seconds per year. Now, how do you visualize that? Well, think about this. The full moon is about a half a degree displacement. If you look at the angle from our perspective out to the full moon or the orb of the sun, are both going to displace about a half a degree. So it takes about 72 years to move 1 full degree, for the vernal equinox to move 1 full degree. So if you started, at a very early age and begin to observe it for a full lifetime, you would soon realize that it has moved a little bit with respect to the stars. Of course, the problem is the vernal equinox, you're going to be looking directly at the sun. So I think ancient peoples had come up with more ways to determine that motion than to actually try to look at the sun and its position at the vernal equinox. Anyways, here's what the authors of Hamlet's Mill said. The equinoctial points, and therefore the solstitial ones too, do not remain forever where they should in order to make celestial goings-on easier to understand, namely at the same spot with respect to the sphere of the fixed stars. Instead, they stubbornly move along the ecliptic in the opposite direction to the yearly course of the sun, that is, against the right sequence of the zodiacal signs. This phenomena is called precession of the equinox, and it was conceived as causing the rise in the cataclysmic fall of the ages of the world. So they saw this connection in their research. They saw this connection of ancient people believing that somehow this cycle, which has often been referred to as the Great Year, was somehow related to a cycle of catastrophes on Earth that affected the like they say, or the rise and fall of civilization. The Greeks still had the old idea, but they asked themselves questions about it. What moved was the sky, but questions about the sky posed abstruse problems. The greatest was, of course, the slow motion of the tilt of the sky described above, which went through a great year of 26,000 years. Now, I mentioned 50 arc seconds per year, which isn't very much. It takes 72 years to move through a full degree. So if you multiply that by 360, you get the sort of the sacred number, if you will, 25,920 years, which is usually rounded off to 26,000. Now, we don't know if 25,920 years is exact or not, because of the fact, for one thing, we don't know if the precessional rate stays absolutely constant throughout the full cycle. So what we're observing now is actually slightly more than 50 seconds of arc per year. So that would mean that it's a little bit shorter than the magic number of 25,920. We just don't know. But typically, most textbooks that I've seen will round off the precessional cycle to 26,000 years. 25,920 is actually closer to the actual period of rotation based upon the current rate, measured rate of 50 plus a little bit of arc seconds per year. And I'm just drawing from a few sources here to convey the idea. The World Year of the Persians, this was a couple of Orientalists, highly respected in their field, who wrote in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, the notion of cyclically recurrent cosmic disasters, a catastrophe by flood, alternating with one by fire, has been traced from ancient Babylonia and Iran through Pythagorean and Stoic philosophy and thence into the medieval world. So this is, whether we go to the Greeks or the Mayans, the Hopi Indians, any number of cultures, both still extant and ancient, we find very similar ideas, and usually involving flood and fire, sometimes alternating, sometimes happening simultaneously. And we now know, though, that nature provides ways to do both on a very large scale. In classical Greek and Hellenistic literature, the doctrine of the Great Year was already connected with the myths of deluge and ekparousis. Now, that's destruction of the world by fire is deluge. The Greek term for that was cataclysmos, and then ekparousis is the destruction of the world by fire. These catastrophes were supposed to return periodically when the planets came together in certain signs of the zodiac. In the Persian system, we still find the deluge connected with the conjunction of the planets. Now, this idea here is that whether you accept this literally or not, and there's some rather tantalizing evidence to show that the influx of comets from the Kuiper disk may be connected to conjunctions of the planets. But the idea here is that they saw that the astronomical realm was the source of these catastrophes. And so here is now jumping to science. This was actually a graph, almost 30 years ago, but it's still relatively accurate. And if you look at this, this is, like it says here, a sea surface temperature graph as a proxy for global climate change, clearly displays a regular succession of glacial and interglacial ages. So what you're seeing here is the peaks represent an interglacial, such as we are in at the moment. You know, we are in an interglacial. Sea levels are relatively stable at their current level. And we know that 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, the planet was in the midst of a full glacial cycle. Now, full glacial cycle, you have to roughly double the amount of ice that's on the planet now. And when you do that, you've extracted about 400 feet or even more from the levels of the global oceans. So during a glacial cycle, you can picture this. If we were to go into a glacial cycle now, what would happen is you think every year water is evaporated from the oceans primarily, I mean also from lakes and rivers and even groundwater, respiration from plants, but primarily it's going to be the ocean. The water's evaporated, it precipitates out as rainfall, or in northern latitudes as snowfall. Like where I grew up in Minnesota, we get about 6 feet of snow every year. And then come spring, that snow all melts. It flows back in, becomes part of the hydrosphere, which we would say the cryosphere is the realm of snow and ice. The hydrosphere is water. So the snow and the ice melts. It goes back into groundwater, surface water, makes its way back to the ocean, right? And it does this cyclically. Now, at the onset of an ice age, imagine that winter comes on, but spring doesn't come back for 15,000 years. And essentially, in a way, in an oversimplified way, that's what we're talking about. And we now know that the onset of the late glacial maximum, which is called the late Wisconsin in the Western Hemisphere in North America, came on extremely rapidly. And it may have even been so rapid that it literally was like a switch that went off, and then spring didn't come back until 13 to 15,000 years later. We still don't know the full mechanism of that. I think it's a dynamic process of several things occurring simultaneously, that if they occur just with the right synchronicity, it can trigger the crossing of a threshold. But anyways, imagine that the snow now falls each year, but it doesn't melt. So it just builds up and builds up over thousands of years. And then between roughly 28,000 years ago, say, and about 15,000 years ago, the ice got to be perhaps as much as 1.5 miles thick over northern North America. I'll show you a slide in a minute that kind of displays that. But picture all the northern cities in the U.S., from Boston to Detroit to New York to Philadelphia, Chicago, the Twin Cities, Spokane, Washington, Seattle, Washington. They were all buried under thousands of feet of ice. So it was a very different world. Sea levels were much lower. So when you drop sea levels by 400 feet, you know that the coastlines are going to migrate seaward, aren't they? And that's going to expose the continental shelves that rim all of the continents of the world. Like here on the East Coast, there are places where the coastline, the shoreline, would have been as much as 50 miles further east than where they are now. So it created a whole new ecosystem, in effect, when the sea levels dropped, that really would have been the prime habitable real estate to any culture or group of people at the time living. Would have found probably the living on coastlines during the Ice Age would have been the least malign, given the the extremity of the climate at the time. Now, of course, when the reverse of that happens, and this is where the mystery comes in, because we know that around 15,000, I think most of the research now would suggest around 14,600 years ago, there was what is called meltwater pulse 1b. Now, somewhere around there, the climate started warming from the late glacial maximum. Sea levels started coming up, say around 14,500 to 15,000 years ago. Slowly, they started coming up, but at about 14.6, there was a massive pulse of meltwater to the ocean. What was driving that? I don't know, for sure. But then, come 12,000, just around 12, a little bit less than 12,900 years ago, is the lower Younger Dryas boundary. And this is where the controversy is surrounding what happened there. It was a very sharp and sudden return to full glacial cold after several thousand years of gradual warming. Now, I will mention that the gradual warming is probably the effect of orbital variations of the Earth, the geometric variations between the Earth and the Sun, called Milankovitch cycles. So you have the tilt of the planet changes somewhat, the eccentricity of its ellipse changes somewhat, and the three factors of the Milankovitch cycle can work together. So sometimes they cancel each other out, sometimes they amplify each other. The result is that there can be warming and there can be cooling on a relatively gradual basis. At the Younger Dryas, something very different happened. It was a very sharp return to full glacial cold after a couple of thousand years of warming. So just for your information, the Younger Dryas, younger implies there was an older Dryas. So if you go back pre-14,600 years ago, there was a cold spell. It was called the Older Dryas. Now, what is Dryas? Well, it's named after a flower, a polar wildflower, a cold-loving flower called Dryas octopetala, meaning it had it was an eight-petaled plant, eight-petaled flower. So Dryas octopetala loves cold weather. So if you find pollen from that particular plant in a sedimentary layer in the soil or whatever, you know that those kind of plants were growing there. If that disappears and you have pollen from warm-loving plants, it tells you that the ambient environment in that area changed. Now, so there was a very abrupt change to the Dryas octopetala at the Younger Dryas boundary, the lower Younger Dryas boundary. It lasted for an estimated about 1,300 years, and then at about 11,600 years ago, there was a spasm, an extreme spasm of unexplained warming at this time, and as a result of that, it was like the second jolt that it took to move the planet out of the Ice Age, because the planet was gradually warming. If you can picture this model, the planet is gradually warming, gets to the Younger Dryas, it suddenly returns to full glacial cold. Then for about 1,300 years, it's very cold. Glaciers almost certainly begin to grow again. And then at 11,600, there's a second spasm of warming. And this one carried through, and over the next millennium, the planet emerged from the Ice Age. And we were then shifted from the geological epoch, the Pleistocene, which is now dated to begin like 2.5 million years ago. So through all of this long ages of the Pleistocene, now we're in a totally new epoch, the Holocene, which is the whole of the recent period that we're in. And it was the Holocene where we see civilization, the first appearances of what we think of as civilization. We see the first urban complexes, for example, around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. We see the dispersion of languages. We see domestication of animals. We see transition to sedentary lifestyles and the beginnings of agriculture. I think that, though, we would be justified in hypothesizing that perhaps we might be looking at a reboot, if you will. That, you see, you have to understand that we modern humans now, I think the latest skeletal dating that I've seen that implies the presence of modern humans just like ourselves on the planet goes back 180 to 200,000 years. If we take the higher of that number, we're looking at about 7,000 generations of modern humans. We don't know when that first modern human first walked the earth, but you know, they keep getting older and older and older. And so we got to ask the question, was there, how it would be that during all those long generations, nothing that we would define as civilization was able to take root and grow. Now, I might talk on Monday about, I think I have an idea that perhaps we could go back as far as 120,000 years ago, and there was a period called the Eemian. It's dated from 116,000 to 129,000 years ago. It is considered, out of the last 250,000 years, to be the closest analog to the modern Holocene. Now, if we go back into the depths of the Ice Age, one of the things we find is that because of the cold weather, which I think the sun had to have played the primary role. There may have been periods of volcanism that contributed as well. Other things, perhaps even on a galactic level, influx of cosmic dust. There could have been multiple things, but what we see is that for 1,000 years of the Younger Dryas, it's very cold, it gets warm again. In that warmth, we see the emergence of modern civilization. But during the late glacial maximum, one of the things that would have been happening is as the oceans cool, the oceans begin to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the estimates are that the carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere reached levels as low as 180 parts per million. Now, if you drop another 30 parts per million, you get to 150 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. There's not enough carbon dioxide pressure in the atmosphere to drive photosynthesis, and then the biosphere begins to die. So most of Earth history, carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere were 1,000 parts per million and higher. But what has happened recently is that due to the cold, it pulled the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Then whatever began to drive the warming, when the ocean's warm, the solubility of carbon dioxide in the ocean is a function of the temperature of the ocean water. So if you just think of, like, if you open a soda in a room and it sits there and it becomes room temperature, all the CO2 that gives the fizz in there, it all evaporates out and your soda gets flat, right? Well, same thing in the ocean. It's the carbon dioxide is going to come out of the ocean during the warm periods, and it's going to get drawn into the ocean during the cold periods. So we saw an immediate rise in carbon dioxide of about 100 parts per million. And between 250 and 280 parts per million, it pretty much hovered around that during the Holocene. And then when we began burning fossil fuels, it started going up. So it's at about 420 parts per million now. But it's still, interestingly, lower than most of Earth history. So here's the thing, and the question has been raised. Is it possible that because of that low carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, farming was not really viable? It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but the question has been raised. Maybe it was only with the Holocene that farming, agriculture actually became viable. But if we go back to the Eemian, which was the modern analog, we find that it was actually warmer than now, considerably warmer. It means there would have probably been a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at that time. It lasted about 13,000 years. Like I said, from 116 to 129,000 years are the latest dates I've seen for the Eemian. It's called the Eemian. Sometimes it's referred to as marine isotope stage 5e, because it was I won't get into that, but sometimes you'll see it referred to as that. But it was the Eemian is kind of the climate mode that lasted about 13,000 years. See, I've just done some interesting studies on sea levels during the Eemian. It looks like they were between 20 and 30 feet higher than at present. And you know, as sea levels go up and down, it also changes the land. In that Atlantis presentation that I've done, I talked in considerable depth about isostatic adjustment. the two factors, eustasy and isostasy. Eustasy is rising and falling of sea level due to the growth and shrinkage of glaciers on land. That in turn can trigger isostatic adjustment, which means that if you have a glacial load over, say, the continent, or even a large body of water like Lake Bonneville during the late Pleistocene, it actually causes the crust to depress, and when you remove that load, it rises up. Just think of you're sitting on a comfortable chair, and you sit down on the cushion, and as you sit down, the cushion depresses, and when you stand up, the cushion comes back. So you could think of isostasy in simple terms like that. And we know, for example, that around Hudson Bay, there was at least 1,200 feet so far of rising sea level, rising continental land because of the deglaciation that has occurred. By looking at the shorelines, you can see that the rise was not steady, particularly it wasn't smooth at the beginning, because you can see that it was like jerks, because there's larger differential elevations between the shorelines around Hudson Bay, and they're bigger in the first phase of deglaciation, and then they get successively smaller. But then, and then my theory was that, or my hypothesis, let's be clear on the difference there, is that along the mid-Atlantic ridge, there's evidence of considerable subsidence as a result of the rapid rise of sea level. And I say rapid, that's in a geological sense, because overall, the full sea level rise process took about 10,000 years. But it was not uniform within there. There were pulses of sea level rise, okay? Rapid sea level rise. So going back to this graph you see up on the screen here, the peaks represent interglacials, like we're in now, and the troughs would represent full glacials. And you can see there is a kind of a quasi-periodicity to this. And this is taken from, like it says here, sea surface temperature graph is a proxy for global climate change. It clearly displays a regular succession of glacial and interglacial ages throughout the late Quaternary. The Quaternary is simply the period of time that included the Pleistocene and the Holocene that we're in now. So what I've started considering is this. The basis of any civilization is going to be agriculture. You've got to have, people have to be able to eat and not be continuously engaged in hunt for food, because if they're doing that, they don't have the leisure time to get into anything else. They don't have time to, think scientifically about the world around them and how it works. They don't have time to accumulate, the kind of learning that we would associate with scientific advancement, for example. So you have to have leisure time. You have to have a division of labor. Both of these are going to come about in a kind of environment such as we're in now, the Holocene. Well, if we go back to the Eemian, it appears that you had 13,000 years where agriculture would have been very viable. For example, Greenland, half of Greenland was deglaciated. In fact, there were what is now a single ice cap. It melted mostly away, and there were two domes of ice. You could travel from the west coast of Greenland to the east coast, and it was quite verdant, actually, during the Eemian. So when you start thinking about that, my thought was this: so you had a period when agriculture probably would have been viable in large areas of the world that was not viable, after the end of the Eemian, when we go back into what's called the Wisconsin Ice Age. And the more I begin to think about it, the more I begin to think, maybe the challenge is more like to explain why civilization wouldn't have arisen during the Eemian period. Because obviously, if everyone has enough food to eat, it's a warm, relatively benign climate, you're going to automatically have leisure time. And that leisure time, assuming that the people are as intelligent as we are today, they're going to be curious, they're going to be making observations of the world around them. And that, to me, would lead to accumulated learning. And if you think about how quickly we went from primarily an agricultural-based society, feudally based in terms of our economy, to what we're at now. Go back 300 years. Look how much we have advanced culturally, scientifically, technologically, industrially in the last 300 years. For those of us that are the older generation, when my grandparents were born, the primary mode of transportation, was horseback, horse-drawn carriage, and by foot. I mean, my grandparents were born in the 1890s. So, I mean, we had trains, obviously, but then my great-grandparents and their parents, think about how far we've come and how quickly. Now, imagine 300 years. How easily could 300 years of progress be lost in the noise of 150 or 200,000 years? See, that's why I'm of the mind that we need to be open to the possibility that there have been civilizations in the past that have arisen and succumbed to natural changes. And when we go on here, and you see some of the stuff that I'm talking about, I think you'll understand how some of these events that I'm going to show you have happened. If they happened again, the archaeologist 10,000 years from now would be digging up the remains and looking and trying to figure out our civilization, and most of what we've created wouldn't last. If we wanted to create infrastructure that would last, how would we do it? Well, we'd probably turn to megalithic stonework. We'd have 10 to 50 to 100-ton stones, and we'd create structures on that scale with the idea in mind, well, the kind of catastrophes that we could expect, these structure like this would survive. Now we'll go, so this is from the early 90s. It has not become obsolete. In fact, it's been shown to be quite accurate still. What you're seeing here, these are oxygen isotopes in Greenland, and I'm not going to necessarily get into try to explain how it works, but the oxygen isotope content of the ocean changes according to temperature. And on this particular graph, we're looking at, down the center there, we're looking at 10,000 years of change. And these are from Greenland ice sheets, cores, that have taken core samples that you picture about 4 or 5 inches in diameter. They drill all the way to bedrock. They take this out and they start analyzing these annual layers, and they look at the oxygen isotopes in there, and that's a proxy for temperature change, both warming and cooling. And if you look at this particular graph, you see down the right side it goes from 0 down to 10. That's 10,000 years ago. And then over on the left will be the depth. You see that 1,500 there, that's 1,500 meters of depth. So at 1,500 meters deep, we're down 10,000 years ago. Bear in mind, though, that this ice is it's probably close to 1.5 miles thick right there. So, as it says here, the graph of the last 10,000 years of temperature changes preserved in Greenland ice cores shows temperature constantly and repeatedly warming and cooling 2 degrees to 3 degrees Fahrenheit or more. There's a little spike. Let's see. I don't have a pointer, do I? Let's see. Do I have and I don't have a mouse, so I can't point things out. But if you look there down towards the bottom, you see that there's a little spike to the left. You see that? Okay, that's about 8,300 years ago, and that was a sudden cold snap of about 4 degrees, and it lasted about 100 years. So that would have been a major disruption in the post-glacial world, right there. And then you'll see at the very bottom, it sort of drifts to the left, right? Remember, shifts to the right are warming, shifts to the left are cooling. What you see here, you don't see a steady state. What you see is the climate is constantly fluctuating, at least in the region of Greenland, and other studies now have shown that the climate was fluctuating on a planetary-wide basis, not just in Greenland, but the planet is fluctuating a couple of degrees back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I have another graph, which I didn't include here, but it shows that there was the cultural activity that went on as these changes occurred. We've just emerged from a period called the Little Ice Age. Now, the Little Ice Age has been the coldest roughly 700 years since the end of the Great Ice Age. Now, this is important context to keep in mind when we start talking about global warming. The Little Ice Age, like I said, coldest period, not quite a millennium. It really began in the late 1200s and early 1300s after a period called the Medieval Warm Period. The Medieval Warm Period followed a time called the Dark Ages Cold Period. Okay, so it had shifted from from the Dark Ages cold, the medieval warm period, and we're talking about a degree and a half to 2.5 degrees shift. Okay, so during that cold period of the Dark Ages, which began around actually can be pinpointed to almost 1 year, 536 AD. And over the next decade, the planet got very cold, very quick, and it took about 300 years to come out of that. And when it did, ocean levels came up several feet. The northern hemisphere warmed. That was when the Scandinavians sailed west and started farming on the west coast of Greenland. This was during the medieval warm period. During the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, one of the things that happened was 536 AD was sometimes referred to as the coldest year of the last 2,000 years. Okay? As a result of that, there was agricultural collapses, so that was followed by famine, and in about 544 AD, that famine led to weakened immune systems, and you had what's called the Justinian plague. And the Justinian plague wiped out at least a third of the European population. There were probably other places around the world that got depopulated as well, but this was the most well documented during that period of time. And it took literally about 300 years for the planet to emerge from the so-called Dark Ages. And then when it did, you had a warming of the climate between 900 and 1000 AD, and as a result, agriculture came bounding back, and the growing season got longer. The elevation at which farming could be conducted went up like 400 feet, so it created a whole lot of new areas for croplands. And then people, because of the ample food to eat, what you see is that lifespans got longer, infant mortality declined, people actually got more robust. There was actually evidence that people's stature increased during the medieval warm period. And then, as a result of this, after about 100 years of this, European society, as an example, became quite wealthy and was able to undertake the great cathedral building era that lasted until the early 1300s, and then almost as suddenly as it started, it stopped. And what stopped it? Well, a very quick return to cold, when the medieval warm period gave way to the first phase of the Little Ice Age. And as a result of that, you had a couple of decades of impoverishment. You had agricultural failures because of cold and wet and damp. Crops would die in the field. People's immune systems got weak. And I think it was about 1340, between 1340 and 1344, you had the onset of the bubonic plague, which in some cases wiped out half the population of Europe. In other places, whole villages were completely decimated. I think the estimates are that perhaps the population of Europe was declined by at least 30% or more, by 1/3. And that was the end of the great cathedral building enterprise for the most part. And then we went into the Little Ice Age. And with some breaks, it wasn't steady, but overall there was primarily two phases. The final phase of the Little Ice Age only ended about between around early 1800s and the early 1900s. So our baseline for talking about global warming, you have to keep in mind, is based upon the coldest period of time, the coldest century since the end of the Great Ice Age. And during the Little Ice Age, glaciers worldwide grew. And maybe we'll get into this on the Monday class. There's some great, interesting woodcuts and artist renderings, and even later photographs showing how massively the glaciers grew during the Little Ice Age, completely overrunning farms, villages, and like during the witch burning period, a lot of that was based upon these episodes of severe cold, and religious fanaticism blamed it upon witches. And then so you can see there's actually been studies showing that the burning of witches and the suppression of women's wisdom was correlated almost directly with declines in the climate. I'm not quite sure how to take that applause, but Was that a good thing or a bad thing that they? Personally, I think it was a bad thing, but anyhow, and there's sometimes I think we haven't really progressed that far beyond that. But okay, so now here's where it's going to get interesting. If you've hung with me this far, we go back to 10,000 years ago, and we're right at the very end, the final tail of the Great Ice Age, and you can see we're kind of, it's drifting from the left, which is the cold side, over to the right. When we go down deeper than that, we see that the Holocene, in a relative sense, has been quite stable relative to what happened before. So let's go back to 250,000 years. Okay, same graph. There it is. Okay, now watch this. Oh, here we go. Now, how do we explain that? Look at down there near the bottom. Look at those spikes to the right. Now, there is some serious global warming for you. Now, here's what we're trying to unravel. What is driving that magnitude of climate change? Well, I think it's a correlation of things. I think that planets get smashed by comets and asteroids. I think we're learning, and I know Robert I'm certain is going to talk about this, that the sun is much more variable than we assume. And I personally think that there's some evidence that suggests there may actually be a link between the influx of material and mass into the solar system and that there is a solar response. So, looking at other star systems, we're seeing that sun-like stars that we're now observing actually seem to be extremely variable relative to our sun. So I think we need to be considering that, since we've been making scientific observations of the sun, what we consider the solar constant may not be as constant as we have assumed it to be, which to me is kind of sobering news, but it's part of what we need to take into account as a species living on this planet. Let's keep going here. Here is that transition. Let me see, I'm supposed to be able to go back. Yeah, so if you look at that last spasm there before it swings up into the warmth of the Holocene, you're going to see some big spikes there. And you see the lower spike, that spike from left to right, that's the 14,006 meltwater pulse 1A. The second one there is the 11,600, so they're separated by about 3,000 years. There was a second spike of warming right there, also called meltwater pulse 1B. The extreme shift to the left that you see there, which is towards the cold, that spike there that you see, that's the Younger Dryas. And the Younger Dryas is where the impact proxies are found. But to my knowledge, no impact proxies are found at 14.6 or 11.6. So then in my mind, what's driving the warming at 14.6 and what's driving the warming, that spike at 11.6? There could be impact proxies that show up there. I don't know that anybody's really looked. I think they should. But absent that, what does that by default suggest to me? Obviously, the sun, okay? So I think we're looking here at something that kind of like almost a perfect storm of stuff happening here. And I'm going to show you something when we get to the end, or if we don't have time, I'll be showing it on Monday, which is quite impressive. But anyways, here we go. For measurements of annual ice layer thickness over the past 15,000 years, the authors find that Greenland's climate, emerging from the last ice age, twice shifted from glacial to interglacial conditions over an astonishingly quick 3 to 5 years. Now, can you imagine glacial to interglacial? Can you imagine that our world shifting from interglacial conditions now into full glacial mode within 3 to 5 years? What would that imply for the stability of our civilization? Well, it would imply, I think, that our entire civilization would collapse completely, because there's so many ramifications to what that means. And of course, if we shifted into a full glacial mode now, yeah, I mean, we're going to experience the same kind of agricultural collapses that we saw on a lesser scale during the Little Ice Age and the Dark Ages, right? I mean, I think we would see a global collapse of agriculture. We would see extreme cold that people wouldn't have been able to adapt. I mean, it would spell clearly the end of our civilization. But this is what the scientific record is showing. Now here's a graph of sea level rise showing the two spikes. The one on the right is meltwater pulse 1A, which is now dated to about 14,600. The one on the left is meltwater pulse 1B. And you see that there's double graphs because when this was done, the dating hadn't been refined to the extent that it has now. So this is actually showing the range. Like if you look at meltwater pulse 1A, you'll see there's a range. It shows there between the earliest estimated time that it occurred and the latest. And you'll see that dashed line, kind of that curved line going up, coming down. That would be sort of the previous model of a smooth melting, reaching a peak and then tapering off. But now, once we have much more accurate information to go on, we see that it wasn't a smooth curve, it was a spiked phenomenon. And interestingly, this is the late Pleistocene mortality graph. For those of you that want to see this better, I can provide the sources for this, but you can see that, interestingly, you'll see that graph that's the late Pleistocene megamammals that inhabited the Earth that are now gone. And I'll mention something briefly about them. We've lost roughly half of the species of animals over 100 pounds in body weight. Anything over 100 pounds in body weight, or about 44 kilos, is considered a megamammal. So we're in a room here full of megamammals. So if it's a new way for you to think about yourself. Unless you weigh less than 100 pounds, then you are not in the megamammal club anymore. So what you see here is that each square here represents the finding of a fossil of an extinct megamammal. And of course what you see here is that at the end it just spikes dramatically around the Younger Dryas. Okay, so we've got the in effect what you see with the graphs that we just saw is that there was a period there of highly unstable climate. And how did the megamammals? I don't necessarily think that they all died instantly, but it may have actually been successive stages. To me, that's kind of what it looks like, with maybe the final coup de grace occurring during the Younger Dryas, because to my knowledge, coming out of the Younger Dryas, I think the woolly mammoths and the giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and the Irish elk and the cave bears and the giant short-faced bear and the castoroides and all the rest were gone, right? So they didn't survive. Now, there's evidence that mammoths did survive, even down to maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, but they survived on islands and they shrank in size, probably because of limitations on their territory and so on, but they're called pygmy mammoths. And so it wasn't a complete extirpation like in one fell swoop, but it was close to it when you look in the geological sense. So we see that this mortality graph correlates very well with this graph and with the spikes that we saw defining the period from 14.6 to 11.6. I'll also mention that interesting Plato, as some of you who've watched my Atlantis presentation know, that Plato named that date for the destruction of Atlantis. He placed that at 9,000 years prior to Solon's journey to Egypt, where he heard the tale. And interestingly, his journey to Egypt took place around 2,600 years ago, about 600 BC. So do the math. It comes right out to 11,600. So how interesting. And of course, generally, if it's even noted by historians or archaeologists or whomever, it's just dismissed as a mere coincidence that he places the destruction of Atlantis through an event of subsidence sinks beneath the waves during an exact period of time that we know that sea level was rapidly rising, even to the point where it's been called meltwater pulse 1b. So now here is essentially a graph that shows us the distribution of ice in the northern hemisphere now. And you can see that there's sea ice over Antarctica, and then there's continental ice or land ice over Greenland. And then I'm going to go back to late glacial maximum times, and it looked more like that. So there was a whole lot more ice in the world. And if I go, let's see one more. Yeah, here we can see on this now we're focusing on North America. And on the left, we actually have two great ice sheets in North America. The Laurentide, which is roughly centered over Hudson Bay, and it's about the size of the Antarctica or South Polar ice cap is now. The Cordilleran ice sheet, you can see there's that little division between them that's they're just right, it's pretty much just east of the Rocky Mountains out on the prairies of Alberta. And that was what some paleontologists and anthropologists have referred to as the ice-free corridor, which may have been a migratory route both for animals and early human migration into North America. Cordilleran ice sheet was roughly the mass of the modern Greenland ice sheet, and the Laurentide ice sheet was roughly the mass of the modern Antarctica ice sheet. And of course, they're both gone now. And there was also, if we go back one, you can see that there was also enormous buildup of ice over northwestern Europe as well. So between all of that ice, there was more than double the amount of ice than we find on the Earth today. And that was resulted in the 400, possibly even as much as 450 feet decline in sea levels. And this is a series of images, just to give you an idea. Now, this is what this is going to do. It's going to show the continental shelves, and it's going to show the coastlines of the world if you drop sea levels 350 feet. So keep that in mind, that what you're going to see now is actually very conservative, because sea levels were at least 50 feet lower than 350 feet. But so here's the world, and I'm going to toggle back and forth a little bit here so you can see the change, the geographic changes. And then we'll zoom in on a couple of areas so you can, there's North America. I want you to look up there by Alaska, and you see the light blue area, that is the shelf, and that is what was called Beringia during the Ice Age, because it was a whole intact ecosystem that was heavily populated by mega mammals. And when I go to the next slide, watch what happens. That's a pretty dramatic change. And look at the islands and things up there in northern Canada. Going back, look at the peninsula of Florida. So you can see, look what happens to the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things that did was at present the Gulf Stream diverts into the Gulf of Mexico, and because of that diversion, it picks up a lot of extra heat that is now taking and delivering to northwestern Europe before it loops back to the south. But during the late glacial maximum, it bypassed the Gulf of Mexico. So that would have contributed to the cooling, very much so. Here is an area that Graham Hancock has referred to quite frequently in his work. You see, this is Indonesia down here. You see Australia, and you see the islands. Now, if we drop sea levels 350 feet, there's a lot more land mass. Probably would have been a favorable place to settle during the late glacial maximum. Remember again, this is still, if we drop it another 50 feet, some of those islands even become more connected. And this is likely during these times, during one of the full glacial times, I think it's speculated that would have been the most logical time for Australia to be populated. But now we're going back 50 to 60,000 years ago. And here's northwestern Europe. So I want you to notice Scandinavia, notice the British Isles there, and then you'll notice the light blue is the shelf. We're going to drop sea levels 350 feet. No British Isles are part of the continental mainland. How many of you realize that? I know some of you did or do. So I think you can see, I'm just trying to give you the idea that it was a very different world. And not that long ago, in a geological sense, this is just a blink of the eye, right? So this level of change needs to be factored in when we start trying to understand the history of our own species on the planet, because our ancestors lived through all of this. In fact, they probably lived through 4 cycles, something like this. And just another graph of... So, which brings us back to Asteroid Day. Asteroid Day is a UN-sanctioned global awareness campaign participated annually on the 30th of June. Our mission is to inspire, engage, and educate the public about asteroids, opportunities, and risks. Every year we produce Asteroid Day live, a live broadcast with asteroid content and commentary from astronauts, experts, and celebrities. Asteroid Day events are held around the globe thanks to thousands of independent Asteroid Day event organizers. So what is today's 15th, right? So Asteroid Day will be coming up in about 2 weeks, and it will be commemorating the great event in June 30th of 1908. And how many of you have heard of the Tunguska event of 1908? Most of you, or at least half of you anyways. I would argue one of the most important events of the 20th century, right up there with world wars, the invention of the atomic bomb, and perhaps even the moon landing, right? Once we understand contextually what it's implying. Okay, so I kind of look at it as the idea of cosmic forewarning. And as it says here, the Tunguska, perhaps the earliest widely held theory for the Tunguska explosion was that the world was about to end. Now, of course, that's the people who experienced it directly. And what we find is very consistent across the spectrum of legends and mythology and so on, is these kinds of events are usually looking at as heralding the end of the world. The Tunguska impactor exploded above a sparsely inhabited region in central Siberia with the force of 15 megaton bomb. The blast wave flattened trees over 2,000 square kilometers, which is just over 800 square miles, and excited a magnitude 5 earthquake. Thermal radiation scorched trees and set fires over much of the range. Even 70 kilometers away, an observer removed his shirt for fear it would ignite. Thermal radiation, so think of this, and I'll show you some more graphs in a minute. 800 square miles, what is that? Well, if you look at a major metropolitan area, like you can look at Washington, D.C. or Atlanta is a good example. What you're going to find is that, for example, I don't know if I have it in here, but I have a graph that I've done that shows 285, which is the perimeter highway around Atlanta, and in Washington, D.C., I've done a graph of that as well, showing the perimeter highway. Well, turns out that the area inside the perimeter highway 285 of Atlanta is about 800 square miles. So if the Tunguska event, the bolide that blew up over Siberia in 1908, blew up over any major city on the earth, it would destroy most of the city. And again, 15 megatons. And the largest bombs in the U.S. arsenal during the peak of the Cold War were 15 megatons. The largest bomb ever tested by the United States was about 20 megatons, and the largest bomb ever tested by the Soviet Union back in 1962 was about between 50 and 55 megatons. But it was so big and so heavy, they didn't have a way to transport it, thank God. But anyways, it gives us an idea of the magnitude when we look at the energies released during cosmic impacts. We kind of have a gauge here that we can use, which is our own above-ground nuclear testing that went on in the late 40s, 50s, and the 60s, which thankfully is not going on anymore. Okay, so many other reports refer to the devastation of the forest and the felling of the trees in uniform directions, one to the destruction of several Tungus families and one to a forest fire. The Tungus' terror of the district will be understood when I report that Professor Kulik, who was the first scientist to reach the area, told me the occurrence had caused the evolution of a new tribal religion. They regarded the arrival of the meteorite as a visitation from a god named Agdi, meaning fire, to punish the wicked. The place is believed to be accursed. So, in fact, they were so superstitious about it that one of the first guides that took Kulik to the site, upon his return, he was killed because it was off limits. They wouldn't go in there, and they didn't want anybody else to go in there because they felt that the whole region was accursed. This was actually one of the first English reports that was presented to the Western public back in 1931. So Kulik didn't even make it to the site till 1927, almost 20 years after the event. That's how remote it was. And let's see, if you look carefully, again, I don't have my pointer here. If you look at where it says Eurasian, look just above and to the right of the A, and you'll see a yellow little kind of exploded icon. That was where it occurred, over Siberia. And here's another closer up view. And then what this is showing is when the Kulik and other scientists that followed him began to interview people on on their experience and where they saw it. What they found was that there was an increase in the number. The length of the arrows here depicts the number of reported sightings based upon which direction did you see it come from. Essentially, it's pretty much, I think, come now that it came from the southwest, and it came from the direction of the sun. So it was not, because it came very early in the morning, right at sunrise. One problem there was, people couldn't see it. There's Kulik, first scientist to reach the region of the Tunguska catastrophe. And crossing the Taiga, here's Kulik's intrepid team dragging boats across rapids on the river Kushmo to reach the site of the great explosion. It took them months to reach the site, by the way. And this is what they found when they got there. This is a pretty famous photograph that you'll see in virtually every account of the Tunguska explosion. So this is 800 miles, and what they realized was that the trees were not blown over randomly, but there was an epicenter under which was about 100 plus square miles where everything was completely incinerated, and radiating out from there, splayed out in every direction, the trees were laid out. So you can almost picture that the shock wave came down, hit the earth, and then moved laterally and just mowed down the trees as it moved outwards. And I don't know if Chris Cottrell is here, but one of the things that were observed there was a series of shallow elliptical depressions, which to me remind me very much of the Carolina Bays. Here's another one. It says here, one of the small oval bogs that Kulik had erroneously I'm having a hard time reading that because normally I'm working from my laptop, so I've got it right here. To secondary origins. Let me see. Can you read that from out there? Okay, that's the main thing. I want you guys to read it. Now, was it erroneous or not? I don't know, but there were a lot of these shallow elliptical depressions in the region of the blast zone. So here's a photograph of crater swamps found in the area beneath the epicenter of the blast, and you see that there are shallow elliptical depressions. And here's a more recent photograph of one of the oval bogs, which to me are very mindful of the Carolina Bays. So it was based upon this. My first visit to the Carolina Bays was in the very early 90s or late 80s. I don't remember the first time. I did an aerial flight. I hired a plane and flew me over the bays must have been, I think, about 1991, and took photographs. I don't have them in here. But when I saw these photographs, I thought, they're so similar. And that's what led me to think Carolina bays were the byproduct of some kind of a multi-impact event, like the fragments of a comet nucleus or some such thing. And I know I missed Chris's presentation earlier today, but I do tend to talk to him because he's been continuing to research and he's stayed more up to date on what the latest thinking is about the formation of the bays. So you can see on this one you've got that what's called the butterfly shape. I've got a cross showing the long axis and the short axis, and it's within that boundary region there that it's about 800 square miles of total devastation. So here are some of the observed characteristics of the Tunguska event. So there was a ball of fire, brighter than the sun. There was a multicolored, often rainbow streamers forming a tail when the thing was seen coming in. Sky opens up and pours out. When in the Monday class, we're going to look at some of the really interesting and compelling eyewitness testimony. But you'll see that this is what they're describing. The sky split in two, deafening thunder. In fact, our case, there's examples of the explosion was so loud that it caused deafness in people. There were people who literally lost their hearing because the explosion was so loud. Subterranean trembling, shaking like locomotives passing below. That was another thing that they commented on. It's because, it said it's created a magnitude 5 earthquake. So people not only experienced something happening in the sky, they felt the earth trembling under their feet and literally a roaring beneath their feet moving through the crust of the earth, which to me is very interesting. And there's an interesting possibility there, which I'm going to get into on Monday, because of the geophysical conditions in the site where this explosion occurred. There was a sense of heavy beams or stones striking the ground and buildings shaking, intense pressure blast wave, extreme heat pulse. Others described a pillar of fire followed by a pillar of smoke, which somewhat obviously suggestive if read accounts in the Bible, the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke and so forth. There were secondary effects associated with the Tunguska event, such as anomalous optical and atmospheric effects, or white nights, sky glows, noctilucent clouds, so bright that in Europe, even before the era of gas lights and so forth, people could read newspapers at midnight. And it's still discussion of what that was the result of. If Tunguska was a piece of a comet, it was likely preceded by an ionic tail that may have entered the atmosphere, especially if the thing came from the southeast. It would have come to the northwest, and that would have blanketed Europe with perhaps part of the gaseous tail. There was intense and prolonged solar halos, subsequent intense precipitation events over Europe, decrease in atmospheric transparency detected in the U.S., disturbances in the points of neutral polarization in scattering of sunlight, which is related to atmospheric turbulence. There were magnetic microspherules deposited in regional soils. There was an enhancement of carbon-13 and iridium and peat layers now documented that were associated. Extremely rapid recovery of the forest after the catastrophe. Accelerated growth of trees surviving the catastrophe, and a sharp increase in genetic mutations of plants and animals. I've got a question mark because I haven't read the latest on that, but I find that to be one of the most intriguing possibilities as the result of this cosmic event, that could there be some kind of a connection with accelerated genetic mutations and have an evolutionary implications to it. This is, we're going to skip some of this because I can't read it, but on Monday we'll look at that. So there are many marvelous features in the stories of the Siberian meteor, a story without parallel in historic times. Now this is from Fred Whipple. He wrote a paper 1932. the Great Siberian Meteor and the waves, seismic and aerial, which it produced. And he says, it is most remarkable that such an event should occur in our generation and yet be so nearly ignored. No civilized man sought out the falling place of the meteorite for 20 years, and even now no one has followed up the track of the pioneer. So this is writing in 1930. Now, I will say, though, that we've learned a lot about it that we didn't know until the end of the Cold War, because one of the benefits of the end of the Cold War was that American scientists and Russian scientists began to communicate with one another, and there was all kinds of Russian studies that had been inaccessible to American scientists that now were accessible and began translated. And to me, that is one of the severe downsides of going into this new Cold War with Russia that we're doing, is because now all the dialogue is stopping, right? We're not going to be, we were doing joint missions to the International Space Station. They're going to quit doing that. I will mention, not to get off on this, but just mention the fact that this is the first administration since World War II that has refused to talk to the Russians. And one reason I think we're all here, why we were able to avoid Cold War becoming a hot war, is because we talked. We had diplomacy. We had regular summit meetings. Reagan is well known for it. It's time we start talking again. I'm glad to hear that response. There are many more. Okay, so let's keep going here. So this paper has been devoted to incidental effects and is therefore appropriate to emphasize two coincidences. Seismographs were in readiness to demonstrate that Earth waves can be produced by the impact of a meteor with the ground. But let's bear in mind here now, this is 1930. He didn't know that this thing didn't hit the ground, right? It detonated about 5 miles up into the atmosphere. Now it's coming in at a low angle. So you know that if it's a low angle rather than a steep vertical angle, it has to pass through a whole lot more atmosphere, which means there's going to be a lot more friction, and it's likely, if it's a low density object, and the consensus is now that the Tunguska object was low density, which implies that it was probably a piece of a comet nucleus. It didn't reach the ground. It didn't create a big hole in the ground. Like, how many of you have been to Meteor Crater in Arizona, right? Very impressive, big hole in the ground. Now, of course, that's a baby, right, compared to some of the impact structures on Earth. It's about 1 kilometer wide and 600 feet deep, right? Now, that was produced by an iron object coming into space from a high rate of speed, hits the ground, right? Tunguska didn't hit the ground. It hit the atmosphere, and it blew up 5 miles up in the air. Now, how many of you remember February 15th, 2013, the Chelyabinsk meteor that blew up over that Russian town? Yes. It was only a fraction the size of the Tunguska object. It blew up about 18 miles up, but the shock wave of that blast, which was about equivalent to 500 kilotons, which is, much larger than the Hiroshima atomic bomb, it caused damaged over 7,000 buildings and injured over 1,500 people. Scared the hell out of them, too. And there's some interesting video footage of it online, and there's one in particular, if you see it coming in across the sky from left to right, if you turn the volume all the way up, you're sitting there, you're watching the thing, and about 15 seconds later, when the blast wave hit, pretty darn impressive acoustics. And it makes you go, okay, I can imagine how must have scared the hell out of those poor Tungusi and Evenki people up in Siberia when that thing came in. Anyways, so he says if the impact of a meteor with the ground, microbarographs, which are what detected, like it says here, had been invented just in time to preserve records of the airwaves. So because of the microbarographs, there was a pressure pulse that passed over England twice. because there was a pressure wave that went out from the blast zone, encompassed the planet twice, right? And they didn't know what it was from. It was only years later that they were able to correlate that pressure pulse passing over England with the event in Siberia, and realized that, given the velocity of the pressure wave, it fit perfectly. So anyways, microbarographs had been invented just in time to preserve records of the airwaves generated in the atmosphere. If the meteor had fallen even 5 years earlier, there would have been no evidence for the spreading of the airwaves beyond the immediate locality of the fall. If it had fallen 20 years earlier, we should have known nothing of the earth waves, because the first seismometers had just been installed 20 years earlier. So again, if this had happened 20 years earlier, we probably would have never even known about it. But as it was, the timing was good. Geographically, it was auspicious too, because if it had been just much further north into the tundra, you wouldn't have the tree fall. But given that it was over the taiga forest, we've learned so much about this event from studying the pattern of the forest destruction, right? So the timing of it was auspicious, Then that raises a question like, well, okay, if other events like this had happened and we had no scientific record of it or scientific monitoring of it, then how would we know about it? Well, how you would know about it is basically through stories, through legends, through mythology that's handed down. And we see right there with the Tunguska event, like one of the things that resulted of that was the formation of a new religion, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised that ancient cultures would create stories around events like this, and that's how we would know about it. Yeah, these are just from the microbarographs showing the pressure pulse as it passed over there's London and Cambridge, and you can see, so these showed up on the barographs, but nobody knew what was causing them. It was just an anomalous pulse. And again, only years later was 2 and 2 put together. So here's just a biblical verse. And there suddenly came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. Now when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded. In Monday's thing, I'll have some more interesting, like I said, just compellingly interesting eyewitness accounts. And you'll really see the parallels here. One of the things is described as how when this happened, people rushed out of their houses and were out in the streets. Like it says, they were dumbfounded. Here it says the word is confounded, but in some of the eyewitness accounts, they're saying that the people rushed out and they were absolutely dumbfounded about what had just happened. So this is an interesting little aside, I thought. Possibly has implications. I'm not sure what they are yet, but as it says here from the geological aspect, the Tunguska event occurred in a rather remarkable place in the southern part of the Siberian platform. It was the place of some of the most powerful volcanic activity in Earth's history 250 million of years ago, a former hotspot. The area is rich in various gas and oil and ore deposits, including rare earth elements and platinoids, meaning platinum group. Yeah, I've got plasmoids on the brain, sorry. There are kimberlites in the region too. The upper mantle in this region has anomalous speeds of seismic waves. The Tunguska epicenter is right in the middle of the paleovolcanic crater. Could there be a geophysical connection? I'm not going to say yes or no, I don't know, but it's one of those interesting correlations that you might dismiss as coincidental at first hand, but then again, maybe there is a connection, and I don't know what that would be. I'm hoping Robert will clear it up for me. So, all right. So a little bit about asteroids, because this is now 2 weeks asteroid day, right? I want you all to be prepared for asteroid day. An asteroid is a minor planet, an object that is neither a true planet nor a comet that orbits within the inner solar system. They are rocky, metallic, or icy bodies with no atmosphere. Sizes and shapes of asteroids vary significantly, ranging from 1-meter rocks to a dwarf planet almost 1,000 kilometers in diameter, which is about 600 miles. And we would not survive something on the upper end of that scale striking us. But this is just some examples. Bennu is an example of a carbonaceous asteroid. There's three classes basically: silicaceous, carbonaceous, and metallic. And typically your metallic ones are going to be your densest, hardest ones. The bolide that struck Arizona and created the crater by Winslow was metallic. Asteroid Eros, long axis dimension, approximately 21 miles. Now this is clearly a planet killer. This is bigger than the one that took out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, which was about 66 miles in diameter. Asteroid Ida has its own moon, Dactyl, discovered in 1884. It's the second asteroid visited by a spacecraft, the first to have its own moon. The long axis equals 59.8 or 37.15 miles. So that's a planet killer as well. But there's no danger from any this size, right? Asteroid Itokawa, it's 1,000, 1,100, or 1,100 feet long axis. Now we're getting into the range of known asteroid impacts since the Phanerozoic began, which is the beginning of visible life. There's Vesta. Now that's 326.4. That would be a planet killer. Something this size hitting the Earth would sterilize the planet. But we're not in any danger from anything this big at all. Asteroid Psyche. This is an artist's depiction. It's a metal-rich asteroid with a mean diameter of 140 miles. So the size of the Tunguska object of the left compared to 2001 YB5, which was one that actually was quite dangerous, that regularly crosses the Earth's orbit. Now it's many times bigger than Tunguska. This would, an object this big striking, let's say, North American continent could obliterate several states. I mean, it could easily obliterate a state the size of Texas or more. And it would have global consequences. And here's the Willamette meteorite. And what's interesting about this is it was found in a group of glacial erratics in the Willamette Valley, right? These glacial erratics had been transported via iceberg, floated on icebergs. So this thing was actually probably fell over Canada and was rafted during the great terminal ice age floods aboard an iceberg, carried all the way down from the Cordilleran region, British Columbia, across Washington State, down to Columbia Gorge, and then back flooded into the Willamette Valley. And then the iceberg carrying this, along with the glacial erratics, which were mostly basalt, were deposited on the floor of Willamette Valley. And we're going to keep going here. So this is going to be really quick. This is meteor crater in Arizona. So this is, again, an iron asteroid strikes the Earth, leaves a big hole in the ground that we can see and measure and study 50,000 years later. Tunguska-type events, again, they're going to be gone after a few centuries, the evidence, right? Once the forest regrows. Now we're just going to do a quick succession. This would be an astrobleme. So this is 1.46 miles. Astrobleme means star wound. So you have a crater. This is a crater. This is an astrobleme. It's like a scar on the surface of the Earth, but it's not readily apparent from the ground. See, once we get aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar and geophysical techniques, we can study these things, but a lot of times people didn't know about them. Steinem Basin, this is 14.8 million years old, 2 miles in diameter, and it was about equivalent to an explosion of 125 megatons, or roughly the same as 8,000 Hiroshima bombs, all detonating at once. This is Libya, the BP structure it's called, and it's about the same size. It's 125 megatons. So remember, what did I say? The largest hydrogen bomb ever tested by by humans was between 50 and 55 megatons. Tsar Bomba back in 1962. And I can still remember hearing that on the news when I was maybe 10 years old, and it scared the crap out of me. Brent Crater, Central Ontario. We're kind of going to go up in scale as we see these things. Diameter's 2 miles, explosive energy, still in the same ballpark, 125 megatons. Chubb Crater, now this obviously could be seen from the ground. Age is about 1.4 million years. Explosive energy, again, about 125 megatons. But as we get up here, you're going to see 180 megatons. This is Flynn Creek. You can't see much of this from the surface, but I have visited this, and there are certain things that if you know what you're looking for, diagnostic things that you can look for that are going to tell you that you're looking at an astrobleem. Goat Paddock, Western Australia, 500 megatons. You see, we're getting up. This is about equivalent to 40,600 Hiroshimas. Saskatchewan, 38,000 Hiroshimas, diameter 3 miles. We're just going to speed through some of these. I want you to get the impression more than anything. I visited this crater with my pal Bradley Young, and Wells Creek. So this was a big one, 7.4 miles, 11,200 megatons. Now we're getting up into the range at which the peak of the Cold War, when you look at all of the nuclear weapons on Earth, we're getting up there between 10 and maybe 15,000 megatons of total throw weight, as they call it, for nuclear weapons. It's not that much now. Orunga in Chad, approximately 200 million years old, 10.2 miles, explosive energy, about 36,600 megatons. So now we're way beyond what the entire nuclear arsenals of the superpowers were during the peak of the Cold War, which was between the 60s and the 70s. Before, interestingly, Reagan and Gorbachev got together and started reducing our arsenals. So we got to give Reagan credit for that. And then they continued doing that right up until, well, we won't get into politics, but there are political implications to this, obviously. Let's keep going. So Orunga, Chad, that's the same one. Let's keep going. Okay, visited this one also. I've taken tours out to this one. Upheaval Dome in Utah. It's less than 65 million years. Diameter is approximately 6 miles. This is equivalent to about 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs exploding at once. Now, what's interesting about this is it was long buried, but erosional events have stripped away the overlying layers of rock, exposing the astrobleem that's underneath. I think I've got no, I don't in this one, but yeah, there's a hike you can do, and you can get up on the rim of this thing and look down into it, and it's quite impressive, I must say. This is Clearwater Lakes. Now this was this is 2 objects coming in together, hitting the ground, and you can see the larger of the 2 has a ringed structure. It's highly eroded because, of course, this area has been glaciated, but it's highly eroded. And so this is probably an object, sometimes we see these things, they come in pairs, or perhaps it came into a near-Earth orbit and one object split into 2. I don't know. Karakul in Tajikistan, only 5 million years old. So there's an interesting, around 5 million years ago, there was a major extinction event and climatic change that I think could be associated with this impact right here. It's called the Hemp Hill, which somewhere around this very period of time, I don't know if the dating has been precise enough to definitively correlate it, but oftentimes when I talk about the terminal Pleistocene mass extinction, I say, well, as far as we can tell, it was the greatest mass extinction event in 5 million years. And the previous one that was of similar scale was called the Hemp Hill or Hemphillian extinction event. And it seems to correlate real close in time with this particular impact right here. Now, we're also finding data that suggests that some of the impacts occur in clusters rather than uniformly spread out, which I think is important. 31 miles, So now we're looking at, look at there, we're over 1 million Hiroshima bombs to produce an astrobleme over 31 miles in diameter. But we're going to keep going here. I'm going to get up to the really big ones. This one, I've often thought, hey, you know what would be cool? Take about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and do a canoe trip around this ring here. What? You're ready for that? Okay. Well, we got at least one person ready to sign up for a canoe trip. 2? All right. So, over 7,100,000 megatons. So this would be not a planet killer, but it would certainly be, I think there's some latest papers I've not read that might be associating this with a Jurassic extinction event. And then, of course, this is the Chicxulub astrobleme in Yucatan, Mexico. This is the one that's correlated with the KT boundary and the extinction of the dinosaurs. And you can see it's a multi-ring structure with a central uplift peak. Once you get beyond a certain size, simple craters are just holes in the ground. Then they get more complex. You'll have multi-ring structures because the impact of the crater, basically impact of the object, liquefies the ground and it just radiates outward. Just like if you throw a stone into a pond, but as it's moving outward, it's cooling, and then as it's cooling, it solidifies, and it will preserve multiple rings, and then in the middle, it'll be an uplift. There will be a rebound effect, and it'll lift up and can form a peak, right? So one interesting thing is I went and I explored this area down here, and there's a ring around the rim of this thing of cenotes, which is sort of like karst-like or karst-like or collapse features, where after the impact, the depression filled with, it was a shallow sea, and so it basically filled up with limestone rock. But because of the size, the post-impact seismic activity and the erosiveness of limestone around the ring of the thing, there's a circular ring of cenotes, which to the Mayans were considered oftentimes sacred and entrances into the underworld. And on the Monday presentation, I'm going to show some of the Mayan traditions around that are very intriguing. Anyways, to give you an idea, immediately, so you can see the central uplift there. Now that central uplift is in the center of the astrobleme, right? Now, half of the astrobleme, the southern half is under the Yucatan Peninsula, and the northern half is under the Gulf of Mexico. And right on the coast, there's a little town called Chicxulub that sits directly on top of that uplift, right? The uplift peak. And I inquired as to the meaning of the town, Chicxulub, and learned that it literally translates as horn of the devil, which I found interesting. And there's kind of an artist's depiction of what it would have looked like immediately after the impact, and you would see the inner ring and the outer ring. And interestingly, there's a geometric spacing ratio that is found consistently in large impact structures like this, and it's based upon the square root of 2. And I can show that on Monday's class too, because Monday I will have my laptop in front of me, and we'll be able to ask questions, and I'll be able to navigate around to you know, if you ask a question about the Mayans, I'll be able to pull up that, and we can look at that. If you ask questions about, well, how does the Holy Grail legend, when the Wolfram von Eschenbach talks about that the Holy Grail is actually a stone that fell from heaven, which is exactly what he does. What are the implications of that? Well, we can pull something up on that, and we can look at it. Ah, there it is. I forgot that I had this in there. So there you see the ring, which is the crater, and then the southern half there, there's that whole ring of cenotes around there. And yeah, so there's very interesting traditions about the cenotes. Again, the idea of their entrances into the Mayan underworld. And it turns out that geologically, they are literally entrances into a labyrinth. I went diving in one of them, not very deep, but there were some professional divers in the one that I went to, and they said, yeah, they had been exploring there for years and they had never even found the bottom of it, and because it just apparently went forever into this massive labyrinth of underground submarine and subterranean passageways and so on. Sudbury, Ontario, which is a really old one and really big, one of the biggest on Earth, which is also one of the richest sources of ores and metals on Earth, like one of the biggest sources of nickel, of platinum, of precious metals are now associated with some of these impact structures like Vredefort in South Africa, which is this one right here. 630 million megatons. Now that's pretty darn big, 2 billion years old. So, this is before Phanerozoic life or visible life. But it is also a very rich source of precious metals. So here is meteorite impact sites in North America, which is growing all the time. Every year or two, there are new ones added. This is confirmed. Now, this is old, so it's closer to 200 confirmed impacts now, I believe. Considering that when we go back to the early 20th century, the only one we really confirmed was Barringer Crater or the crater in Arizona. So it's grown from a single crater to almost 200. Now, here's something I need to emphasize is that the craters that we can count are formed by either iron objects, which are dense, can crash into the earth and create the scars, or much larger objects. Like the one takeaway from here is that, like the Tunguska object of 1908, we know about it, because it happened in recent historical times, but if it had happened 300 or 400 years ago, we'd have no way of knowing about it, right? Because forests would have regrowth. The only way we'd know about it, again, is because of traditions. But here's the thing. The objects that would detonate in the atmosphere as compared to the objects that would strike the ground are probably 10 times more abundant. So for every crater, you can figure there's probably at least 10. And of course, when you look at this, notice they're all confined to the continental. How many do you see in the oceans? Not many, a few, a handful, right? But we're assuming that the dispersion of impact sites around the planet is going to be relatively random. And so there should be just as many falling over a given area of ocean as there is over land. So given that we're looking at perhaps, and then you notice, like look down there at South America, you'll see the area of central Brazil and all where the rainforest is. You don't see a lot there. Why? Because just like many of the cities, they're hidden under the jungle. We don't know what's there, but there's no reason to assume that they're not clustered there as well. Same with Antarctica, same with Greenland. We think we know about 2 impact structures in Greenland. The Hiawatha crater was originally proposed as a Younger Dryas impact, and I was kind of skeptical of that for reasons I'm not going to get into now, but it does appear to be a crater at some point. So anyways, here's the point. What you're looking at here might be only 15% of the craters on this scale or impact events on this scale that have occurred on the Earth. Then, if you consider that that's only a percentage of the total number of encounters, and the number of Tunguska-type encounters could be in the thousands. That's not anything too extreme to assume. And the other part of this is that the British School of Catastrophists, kind of led by Victor Klube and William Napier and William Asher and a number of others, have speculated that the greatest danger is not the big, 5-mile wide asteroid, but it's the smaller swarms of disintegrated cometary debris or a broken up asteroid that can create clusters of Earth-crossing material that Earth might encounter from time to time. And I think there's some evidence of that that's pretty compelling. And again, we can look at that on Monday because we've got pretty much almost unlimited time and flexibility there. Just as to give you an idea, Romeo, this was March 26th, which happened to be my birthday. I turned 3 on the day that this happened. And I remember at the time I was quite critical of the matter. I thought this is 11 megatons. Okay, this was one of the larger bombs in our nuclear arsenal, but it kind of gives you a sense of the scale. Recently the Department of Defense has declassified some of the old atmospheric tests, and they're very, very interesting and instructive to watch, to get a sense of the scale of the smaller impact events. So it says here, blast was approximately the same magnitude as the Tunguska event. And this is just showing some scaling here. You've got 15 kilotons at the bottom there. That would be Hiroshima. You've got 350 kilotons, which is typically the size of the warheads now deployed in our missiles, our delivery systems, both in American arsenals and in Russian arsenals and in British and probably Indian arsenals. Because, one of the things that we did was we went from a single delivery system, like a single missile with a single warhead, to multiplying the number of warheads on a single missile. So you have got a delivery system, and that was part of the evolution. And during the Cold War of the arms race was this evolution from one warhead on one missile to up to 10 warheads on one missile. And initially, the missile would fly, it would release its warheads, and the warheads would kind of fall at random over the land. Then the next evolution was that each warhead could be independently targetable. So that's kind of where we're at now. And one of the things that that the Biden administration is pushing for is a whole new level of nuclear weapons that would be targetable to with high degree of precision. And in the old models and the old ideas of the arms race, the idea was that you would have mass destruction. You could have one, if you had a bomb that was 5 megatons, 10 megatons, the idea was you're holding the other country's population hostage, because if you attack us, we've got the means to wipe out every city, right? Well, the evolution of the nuclear arms race in the 70s was going from mutual assured destruction to targetable. So, in other words, if you're going to take out a city, and you're doing a 10 megaton bomb, it doesn't matter if you drop that bomb downtown or 10 miles away, that city is gone. But if you want to take out a missile silo or a super hardened command and control center, you have to have precision targeting. And that is where the evolution of the arms race in the 70s took place, was developing that ability to target with precision. Now, of course, the idea was, as always before, in mutual assured destruction, it was always considered retaliatory, not a first strike. But the evolution of thinking in nuclear doctrine, which most people are completely oblivious to and unaware of, was that when we go to precision targeting, we're going to first strike capability, because obviously if it's retaliatory, you're not going to be trying to take out empty missile silos, are you? And that's where we're at now, is trying to take first strike capacity up to the next level. And people need to know that that's what our government is up to. And again, this whole other discussion, but there's something I want to end up with here. So this is just showing some of the scaling, and this is an artist's depiction of what a 15 megaton explosion would look like over a major urban area, and there wouldn't be anything left. And I don't know, maybe some of you are aware of the fact that Russia's been holding maneuvers in the Caribbean, and that there's now a nuclear-powered submarine off the east coast of the United States, which is not, I understand, carrying nuclear weapons, but could be quickly outfitted with nuclear weapons, capable of taking out the entire east coast of the United States. And of course, what they're doing there is in response to the fact that the Biden administration has now said that we're going to be giving hypersonic missiles to Ukraine that are long range, in other words, being able to reach into the Russian homeland. So that's happening right now as we speak. And I think it's important that people become aware of that. I think that I'm going to have to, I think I just got the signal. We're just getting to the good part, and now. Okay. This is Sarabamba here. Let me see if I can play this. Let's see if it'll work. Here we go.
Take a couple of minutes. We're just going to do a Q&A.
Okay. This is recently declassified footage. Now, is this our future, or using plasma energy to transform planet Earth into the garden paradise of the solar system? I'm pretty clear on which side I would come down on. There was one thing I did want to show, and I particularly wanted, Robert probably already knows about this, and I might have to just speed through a lot of this to get to it, but it's the sun divers. Now, sun divers are a new class of comet that we know ends up falling into the sun, and maybe we'll have to save this for Monday. Look at all this cool stuff I'm having to pass through here. Damn it! So I think we will, but what it shows is that there's an extraordinary reaction in the sun to these cometary masses falling into the sun. And so I think there's a whole possible, oh gosh, look at the, wah. See, now, if I had my laptop, I wouldn't be doing this. I would just jump to those slides. I'd probably have to fast forward through another couple of hundred slides. No, well, not that many. Maybe another 50 slides, I don't know. But anyways, do we have Micah said questions and answers. If anybody has questions, I may or may not have answers, I don't know.
Guide the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Micah.
Can we get our secondary stage mic online? 2. There, thank you. So how we're going to do this, we've got a couple of the Q&As that have been coming in through the C Event app. But I also want to invite questions here from the audience. I'm sure a few of us here present have some questions for Randall Carlson, right? You better. Now listen, I'll direct your attention over to these microphones here and here for that. First, we're going to take a couple of questions from online. If you have a question for Randall here in the audience, you might begin to make your way toward the microphone. We've got a few minutes for this, and we're going to get to as many as we can. First off, Randall, let me ask you this. Do you have a map showing, and this is just a speculative estimate, but do you have a map showing the geography before and after the Younger Dryas events? And that includes land rebound. That question from our online audience.
Yeah, well, the land rebound has been going on. It would have immediately started with the deglaciation, accelerated once the glaciers were removed, and then would have slowed down. So the first couple of millennia after the removal of the glaciers would have been the most rapid phase of rebound. And it's still going on. I mean, they can still measure the uplift of the area around Hudson Bay, but it's much slower than it was, say, 10,000 years ago.
That question, by the way, from our friend Clay Lambert. Hello, Clay. You know, building off of what he's asking, I got one for you here, too. Let's just say that there was a hypothetical landmass out there somewhere in the Atlantic where there might have been people a long time ago, some maybe 12,000 or so years ago. And let's say that that landmass had a name that started with A.
Some hypothetical landmass that started with an A.
Yeah, just, you know, out there in the ocean, maybe beyond the Pillars of Heracles someplace. Now, if such a hypothetical landmass existed, could you tell me what the effect of isostatic rebound would be following deglaciation on such a landmass, along with sea level rise?
Well, okay, I've explained that very thoroughly in this Atlantis presentation. I wanted to cover all the bases so that, you know, I knew that there would be, you know, mainstream guys. You can't even mention the word Atlantis without, you know, getting dismissed with a wave of the hand. But so I actually gave a couple of lectures and a follow-up with a total of over 9 hours. So part of this was explaining how sea level rise are going to see the geoid, which is the attempt of the Earth to maintain equilibrium. So if you look at, like, if you take the dispersion of land mass and crust, whether granitic, continental crust or oceanic crust, it's trying to maintain equilibrium with respect to the Earth's center of mass. Think of a beach ball. If you press it this way, it bulges this way. You know, if you let go of it, it will shrink back to more or less a sphere. That's kind of what the Earth is trying to do. So if you compress with, you know, several hundred billion trillion tons of ice over the North American continent, that depresses down. It actually causes now, according to geophysicists, a lateral movement of molten material below the crust. So it creates an upward pressure on the areas that are distant from the source of pressure. Now, when you release that pressure, you're going to have the opposite effect. And now you're dumping all that weight back into the ocean basins. Particularly the Atlantic Ocean basin has the mid-Atlantic ridge, and there's a triple junction right at the Azores where there is empirical evidence of major vertical movement, vertical tectonism associated with rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. So I make the argument there that if there was an Atlantis, and I go into great detail, this would have been the most likely place and the most consistent with Plato's account.
Fascinating as always. I think this next question might be a physics question or maybe for information science. How do you store all that knowledge in that cranium of yours? No, I'm kidding, actually. But I keep threatening to take him with me to the Azores one of these days, and I'm serious about that.
We're talking about that.
Listen, let's go to some questions from the audience here. I want to start with the gentleman in the coat right over here. Step up to the microphone, please, if you will. Question for Randall Carlson.
Randall, thank you for all of your excellent video and podcast presentations. And not to distract from this awesome presentation tonight, do you have a plan to do a presentation on the moon, possibly next year?
Say that again?
Do you have a plan to do a presentation on the moon?
The moon? What makes you think that I have any interest in the moon? Actually, yes, at some point I am, yes. And it's going to be the very near future, too.
Yeah,
okay.
Neither can I. Sir, right over here, step up to the microphone. Go ahead.
I've heard that the genome has been stabilized for like 200,000 years.
That the what?
That the human genome has been stabilized for about 200,000 years.
The what?
The human genome has been...
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, all right.
Do you happen to know, or is there a list of impacts that has occurred since that, like in that time period? You know?
Oh, yeah, I can. Like,
is it a dozen? Is it a half a dozen? Is it 50?
Well, depends on the size. There's probably
Yeah.
been hundreds if you're looking at Tunguska size. But yeah, I could provide you with that information. All right.
Excellent. Let's go right over here, sir. Go ahead.
So I was actually going to ask about the moon as well. So I wanted to know, like, just maybe briefly, do you think there's people from past civilizations that survived there, or do you think that it's something different? Is there anything you can give us?
What was the question?
There are people or other civilizations that may have survived on the moon.
Oh, I have no comment on that at the moment.
Maybe we'll save that for a future lecture. Let's go to one of our... You want to comment?
Do I want to comment?
You want to comment, but will you?
I will, but not now.
Okay, maybe at a later time. Let me get to a question from our online audience here. This question comes from Laszlo. Randall, does the universe contain straight lines? If so, or if no, rather, how the Platonic solids defined by straight lines can still be explained as valid and real geometric forms being the building blocks of nature?
Oh my gosh.
Take it away, Randall.
I tell you what, if you show up Monday, we'll attempt to tackle that question. But that would be, I think that's more than we could bite off right now.
Perhaps for the Monday session.
Yeah.
That's why they call it the classroom day. Right over here, sir, go ahead.
Given the bullseye shape of the Richat structure, is there any chance that was a impact location?
No, my studies suggest it's purely volcanic. That it was a magma plume that's solidified and then later exposed by erosion. Not an impact. When I first encountered that in the 90s, it was listed as a potential impact site, and I thought, probably can add this to this site. But subsequent research showed that it's endogenic, meaning it's from within the Earth, not from without.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As you can see, of course, dinner is being served. If it's okay, we're going to go ahead and just
So
continue. Yeah,
are you saying then that eating is more important to these people than?
Quite the contrary, dear friend. Quite the contrary.
Well, I'm gonna. You know what? We're at something I'd like to show. I've got this about the Kreutz sun grazers and the sun divers, and I think I've got a video here, and it's showing that there seems to be a interesting connection between activity on the sun and the infall of these. They're called sun divers, right? And just at random, there was a video happened to be showing at the right, recording at the right time, showing one of the sun divers diving into the sun. So now we've got the sun is blocked out here, and we're seeing the normal radiation. Let me see, is this the video or not? What you're going to see here in this video is a comet coming in from the lower right, like at roughly, say, 4 o'clock. It comes in and it hits the sun. It dives into the sun. It's swallowed up by the sun. There you can see, here it comes. Boom! Did you see that? Let's do that again. Okay, here we go. You're going to see the comet coming in from the lower right. Here it comes. Boom! Now, if we have a period of time where the solar system is densely occupied by a whole bunch of stuff like this falling in, could it have an effect on the activity or not of the sun? And it seems highly suggestive that it could, which leads me to think that some of the events we might be talking about are kind of perfect storm events that encompass the entire solar system. And that's where my thinking is now with respect to the Younger Dryas. In that period from 14.6 to 11.6, it seems like a whole lot of stuff went on during that period of time. And we're just at the very beginning stages of thinking it through. And I'm leaning definitely towards the idea that the 14.6 and the 11.6 were most likely solar related, and the 12.9 was probably predominantly impact related. But, you know, I'm still learning. I think we're all still learning, still asking these questions. So anyways, I think we'll stop there.
And thank you, Randall Carlson, sir.